Today, we're going to tackle one of the toughest, most important questions in American history. What really happened to the millions of indigenous people who lived on this continent? We're going to dive into the absolutely catastrophic population collapse they experienced, and the really intense debate over how we should even talk about it.
So, let's set the scene. Before European colonizers arrived in 1492, historians figure there was somewhere around 5 million indigenous people living in North America. I mean, this was a continent just teeming with hundreds of diverse nations, rich cultures, and complex languages.
Now, fast forward to the year 1900, that number, inside the United States, had dropped to just 237,000. That's a collapse of over 95%. Let that sink in. It is one of the most staggering demographic disasters in all of human history.
So what on earth happened? How do you explain a decline that massive? Was it just the tragic but, unintentional result of new diseases? Or was it something far more deliberate? That is the core question we're going to unpack here.
Okay, before we can even start to analyze what happened, we've got to get a handle on the language people use. Because the terms scholars and historians choose, well, they aren't just labels. They completely frame how we understand this entire story.
The whole backdrop for this is something called settler colonialism. Now, this is different from other kinds of colonialism, which might be about, say, extracting resources and then leaving. The whole point here is replacement. The outsiders, the settlers, they come to stay. They want to build their own permanent society, and to do that, they have to eliminate the original population, one way or another, to claim the land for themselves.
And that leads us to a very heavy and very controversial word, genocide. This term was actually invented in the 1940s by a Polish Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. He was desperately trying to find a word to describe the horrors of the Holocaust, and he defined it as a coordinated plan to destroy the very foundations of a national group. But here's the thing you really need to get about Lemkin's idea. For him, genocide wasn't just about mass murder. He saw it as a two-step process. First, you destroy the oppressed group's culture, their language, their religion, their social structures. And then, phase two, you impose the oppressor's culture onto the survivors. This idea of cultural destruction is absolutely central to the debate over what happened in America.
So, how did a population of millions fall apart so completely? Well, historians usually point to three main things, and it's so important to see how they were all connected, how they all fed into each other.
We're talking about direct warfare and massacres, the devastating spread of new diseases, and the forced displacement of entire peoples from their homes. None of these things happened in a vacuum. They worked together with terrifying results.
First, let's talk about warfare. The direct conflicts were often just wildly lopsided. European colonizers had steel armor, swords, and most importantly, guns, muskets, rifles, and even cannons. This gave them a huge technological edge over the wood and stone weapons used by many Native American warriors.
And the violence sometimes was driven by a horrifyingly clear goal of total extermination. Just listen to this quote from U.S. Army Colonel John Chivington, right before the Sand Creek Massacre. "Kill and scalp all, big and little, nits make lice." It's a chilling declaration of intent to kill everyone, even children, based on the logic that they would grow up to be enemies.
Then you have the invisible killers. Diseases like smallpox and measles, which had been around in Europe for centuries, were completely alien to the Americas. The indigenous populations had zero natural immunity, and the result was wave after wave of epidemics that could wipe out 90% of a village in a matter of weeks. And the spread of disease wasn't always just a tragic accident of biology. We have documented evidence of it being used as a weapon. For example, during the siege of Fort Pitt, British commanders actually discussed, and then did, give blankets from their smallpox hospital to the surrounding native warriors. This moment just completely blurs the line between disease as an accident and disease as a tool of war.
And finally, there was official U.S. government policy. Take the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law forced tens of thousands of people, Cherokee, Choctaw, and many others, off their ancestral lands in the southeast and marched them west. On this forced march, known as the Trail of Tears, thousands died, not from bullets, but from pure exhaustion, starvation, and disease.
And you have to understand, these weren't just a few isolated, tragic events. They were part of a sustained, century-long pattern of violence and dispossession. From the Removal Act in the 1830s to massacres like Sand Creek in the 1860s, all the way to Wounded Knee in 1890. So this brings us right back to our central question. When you look at this history, the violence, the disease, the forced removals,
Does the word genocide actually apply? And this is where a huge debate among scholars really kicks off.
The whole debate really boils down to one word: intent. On one side, you have scholars who say, look at the pattern. Systematic massacres, bounties paid for scalps, forced removals, policies designed to erase cultures. This all points to a clear intent to eliminate indigenous peoples. But on the other side, some historians argue that while the violence was terrible, the overwhelming majority of deaths were from the unintentional spread of diseases. They say it wasn't a plan, but a tragic biological consequence.
But, a lot of recent scholarship complicates that whole either-or debate. Modern historians are pointing out that you can't separate the violence from the disease. Colonial policies, like forcing people off their lands and destroying their food sources, created the very conditions, starvation, stress, exhaustion, that made indigenous people so much more likely to die when those diseases hit. The two were tragically intertwined.
And look, this is not just some academic debate about dusty old history books. This history has a real, profound, and enduring legacy that is still shaping lives today.
The consequences are stark. We're talking about the massive loss of languages and cultural knowledge, sure, but also very real, measurable things today. Higher rates of poverty, massive disparities in health and education, and deep generational trauma. There is a direct line from that history of dispossession to the challenges many indigenous communities face right now.
And you might think this all stopped in the 19th century, right? No, not even close. Well into the 20th century, the U.S. government ran programs like Native American boarding schools, where children were forcibly taken from their families to be assimilated. And there was the forced sterilization of thousands of indigenous women, in some cases into the 1970s. This was a continuation of that pattern of cultural and biological destruction.
So, when you look at the whole picture, it becomes clear that what was lost was so much more than just lives. It was this systematic dismantling of entire worlds, their land, their languages, their governments, their families, a complete disruption of a heritage built over millennia. And that leaves us with a profound challenge. Facing this history isn't about assigning blame. It's about having the courage to acknowledge the truth of what happened. Because only after we do that can we even begin to ask the much bigger question: how does a society truly reckon with the most painful parts of its past in order to build a more just and equitable future for everyone?